Hello, and welcome to another episode of my Type 35 build. With things really starting to come together, it isn't taking very many parts to make big changes in how the car looks. Which is what I was thinking when I looked at the car after the front brakes went on and thought, oh, now that's starting to look pretty cool. Especially from the front. The body that once looked kind of frumpy is starting to look a lot more trim now that the front suspension has been added. With the front end assembled even just to this point, what seemed like kind of a wide body is now looking much narrower. The front three-quarter view is really cool looking too, especially when you get down on the car's level. It would be awesome if the car could stay this low. It wouldn't be drivable, but it sure would look cool. Today's focus, however, isn't the ride height. It's what's been added to the front and rear of the car. Namely, the brakes up front and shock absorber set up at all four corners. The brakes, which bolt up to forged spindles with cast steel brackets, are 11-inch rotors with single piston calipers. They've got a 5-on-4.5-inch small Ford style wheel bolt pattern, and they match the single piston caliper vented rotor setup that came from the factory on the S197 Mustang rear axle that I'm using, which also has the same 5-on-4.5-inch wheel bolt pattern. While four-wheel drum brakes could have been fitted, they'd have required significantly more fabrication, and the only gain would have been aesthetic. Disc brakes stop better, require less maintenance, and are far easier to repair than drum brakes. I also attached the front steering arm to the spindle, which bolts on from the rear, and will eventually add a drag link that'll run to the steering box, which should land a few inches forward of the cowl in the engine compartment. Something else that's cool is the shocks have been added. I went with friction shocks that attach using rubber links to connect the shock arms to the top of the front axle assembly. The body of each shock bolts to a pair of tabs welded to the top of the chassis, allowing access to the through bolt from the back side, so the nut on the front side can be tightened to increase or decrease tension on the friction material, and thus adjust suspension dampening. The upper shock arm connects to a bracket I welded to the top of the spring plate by a suspension link that's just a real gem. Original Type 35s used leather shock links, but I decided to take a step up and purchased a slab of styrene butadiene, basically raw car tire rubber, which I carved into the same shape as the original Type 35's leather links. Surface ground them for a uniform finish and, ta-da, rubber Type 35 shock links. They came out looking way more appropriate to the car than a modern tube shock ever would have looked. But for some reason, they look even better on the rear suspension. I don't know why. Maybe it's just me, or it could be how much more compact everything is. That actually changed the shape of the rear links. I'd intended to attach them to the outside of the tab I'd created on the spring perch, but when I assembled everything, they were a little too close to the frame, so I moved them to the inside of the tab to gain some room. The tab, however, wasn't tall enough to accommodate the full radius of the link, so the bottoms and their washers had to be reshaped to match the curve of the rear leaf spring. Should still work just fine, and honestly, the workaround added kind of a neat additional detail over the original setup. And that's about all the news that's fit to print. I think that moving from four-wheel drum brakes, which is what the original Type 35s had at the time, to four-wheel discs might be polarizing, but this is intended to be a modern recreation, so I get to do that. Besides, if vintage hot rods and new Morgan three-wheelers can hang their disc brakes out in the wind, then I have no doubt this car can hang its rotors out with the best of them.